Dr. Stadler, he's received a PhD in medical engineering from the Harvard MIT Division of Health Sciences and Technology. And of course, Rob, when I'm done here, correct me on anything I may have said incorrectly, but he has been a scientist in the medical device industry for over 20 years. And literally millions of his cardiac devices are implanted in millions of patients worldwide. He has also been elected Fellow of the American Institute of Medical and Biomedical Engineers, has obtained more than 140 U.S. patents, and has 20 peer-reviewed publications. Rob is also the author of 2 must-read and must-have books that I'm going to show on screen here in 1 second. The first one being The Scientific Approach to Evolution, What They Didn't Teach You in Biology, and The Stairway to Life, An Origin of Life Reality Check. Definitely 2 must-read books. I'm looking forward to having Rob on again in the future to discuss those books. So they're right here for everybody to see. The Scientific Approach to Evolution and The Stairway to Life. So enough for me. I want to introduce Rob to the show. Rob, thank you so much for giving us your time. We really appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me on there. I really appreciate it too. It's great to be here.
Awesome. Thank you. It's definitely an honor. We've also got Matt and John here. John has actually had an interview with Dr. Stadler on, I believe it was his book on evolution. And I've watched that interview. I definitely recommend it. I learned a lot. It was an awesome interview. So, John, any words from you there?
No, I think if you want to learn more about Dr. Stadler and his first book, which I think is absolutely fantastic and well worth your time to read, puts evolution into a very interesting perspective. I strongly recommend head over to my channel and watch our interview, and then immediately go and purchase his second book, which is Stairway to Life, which I've read, and I can tell you from firsthand experience, as we go through this video today, a lot of the things that we're going to discuss are expanded upon in great detail in Stairway to Life. So just keep in mind as we're going through this, that there's great amounts of substance behind all of the arguments and the positions that Dr. Stadler will be telling us about tonight. Awesome. Thanks so much, John. Matt, as well, thanks for being here. Any words from you?
No, I'm just going to sit back, relax, and enjoy this one.
Yeah, I'm definitely excited for this one. This is going to be a lot of fun. So we've got a video that we are going to go through. We're going to have Rob here. Rob, just let us know when any specific spots you'd like us to pause, give your thoughts.
Awesome.
Okay.
So the purpose of making this video is actually to provide an origin of life reality check to Professor Dave. I don't have any misconceptions that he's going to change his mind at all in the result of this video, but he does have almost 1 million subscribers. And that's really where my heart is to make sure that those 1 million subscribers are not misled by what he says in this video. A lot of people appreciate his educational videos on chemistry and physics, and he does a great job there. But then when he strays from science in order to promote his agenda and trying to promote a natural explanation for the origin of life, I think that prompts the need for a video like this. I also wanted to mention that we're not here to defend Dr. Tor, Jim Tor, that Professor Dave kind of denigrates in his video. We're not here to defend Dr. Tor because he's quite capable of defending himself. We're just here to correct some of the erroneous statements that Professor Dave makes about origin of life. So I think what you're going to hear today is really 2 main concerns that we're going to focus on. To keep it simple, there's just 2 things. And the first topic is about bias, because bias is so important in science, and bias often clouds you from getting to the truth in science. So we have to address that. And the second topic is about sensationalism, or about embellishing the truth, stretching the truth, half-truth. And we have to address that because there's a lot of that going on in Dave's video. So Dave, in his video, he makes some statements basically saying that religious people should not be contributing or interpreting data about or evidence about the origin of life. So we have some snippets from Dave's video on the screen now, and I'd like to play the first segment here.
Although the reasoning behind his stance on abiogenesis is clearly religiously motivated, despite his best efforts to convince people otherwise, he is entitled to his religious beliefs. It is clear that his religious views cloud his capacity to interpret research on this topic.
Okay, hold it there. So that went by kind of quickly, but what you see there is Professor Dave calling out Jim Torr for being biased because Jim Torr has said that he's a Christian. And to be open and disclosing our bias, those of us on this show now also come from a Christian religious background. The trick is, and the trouble is, that when Dave says it is clear that Jim Torr's, religious views cloud his capacity to interpret research on this topic, what Dave is basically saying there is that only atheists are qualified to address the science behind the origin of life. He's basically trying to say that only atheists are unbiased and are able to get to the ultimate truth because they're not clouded by their religious backgrounds. So that actually, I think, is rather a strong hypocrisy on Dave's part, because Dave is an atheist, and that means he has an absolute materialistic or a naturalistic bias. In other words, if you look at origin of life at the highest level, the big picture, there's really just two hypotheses. One is that life began by purely natural processes. And the other hypothesis, the alternative hypothesis, is that life could not have begun by purely natural processes, which means that something beyond natural processes had to help out. But because of Dave's bias, his atheistic, materialistic bias, he blocks the second hypothesis out up front immediately. So all that's left is the naturalistic explanation. And so the data has to support that. And by blocking out a possible explanation and leaving only one behind, that's an extreme kind of bias, which I think is even greater than what Jim Torr has. It's greater than what I have. I think the two possible hypotheses should be left on the table, and then you bring up the evidence and you stack it up and see which hypothesis is best supported by the data. It's certainly an extreme bias to block one of the hypotheses out right up front. So, any comments from you guys on that?
Well, something I would add would be, or not really add, just expand upon, is your point about the bias. I mean, just today, I had an interaction with somebody about this topic, and their position was that the hypothesis of the intelligent agent is purely faith-based, and there is no remote evidence you could have for it. And I find it very interesting. I hear that on a very regular basis. I know we all do. And it's like they forget that on the evolutionary side and the abiogenesis side, it's also being based on deduction and forensic evidence and historic evidence versus actually observed evidence. And Dr. Stadler, you do a great job in your first book, really breaking this down from the evolutionary perspective and looking at, talk about the bias and different things. But I find it very, very interesting how applying the same standards of evidence that you would in any other aspect of science. And I know you talked about this in context of your research. That seems to fly out the window in the context of things that we're talking about tonight, and then just evolutionary, the theory of evolution in general. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, it is important to keep in mind, if you follow the naturalistic, the story about origin of life, you're talking about a singular event that they say happened 4.5 billion years ago. And, there is no remaining evidence of that. There are little hints that they may bring up, but that evidence, is inherently very low confidence. But we do have evidence that we can find in existing life. And we'll talk about that a fair amount, hopefully in the next hour, about the evidence we have from existing life and which of those two hypotheses that the existing evidence supports. And that evidence is directly observable, and you can repeat it and you measure it in life today. And I would like to also bring up that in order to be an atheist, in order to be a rational atheist, you have to have a natural explanation for the origin of life. In other words, believing that there is a natural explanation for an origin of life is absolutely foundational and fundamental. And if that is somehow taken away, then you could still be an atheist, but I don't think you could be a rational atheist, because something beyond natural had to help out or had to be a part of the origin of life. So my point is there that I think atheists have a much stronger bias coming into this, because the very foundation of what they believe is at stake.
And I have something to say to this as well. It would be more of a question for anybody listening, is if our judgment was truly clouded by our belief, then how come the amount of Nobel Prizes are disproportionately in favor of Christians over atheists? If our judgment was clouded, we would not be dominating in that area.
Well, and I know we're going to go on to the next segment, but one other piece, and I'm not going to turn this whole stream into a promo for Dr. Stadler's Stairway to Life book, but something I was really struck by in it, as he dove into great detail, was the plethora of paradoxes that must be accounted for from the purely naturalistic worldview. I mean, it's paradox after paradox, and you and I have talked about this, Rob. Of you didn't even cover all of them, right? And the irony is, we seem to be discovering more potential paradox that have to be overcome. The deeper we get into origin of life research, the more barriers to entry we seem to be finding, rather than solving. And
right,
to me, that really exacerbates the point you're making of who has more bias. If the barrier to entry gets bigger and bigger, and you double down and double down and double down on your belief, who is taking the greater leap of faith? I guess is the point I'd be making.
And in each of those paradoxes, or sometimes called causal circularity, or sometimes called chicken and egg phenomenon, those speak evidence toward hypothesis 2, right? Because those paradoxes are unnatural things, yet we know they exist, they point to hypothesis number 2. So we're back on the topic of bias here, and let's play the video forward to the next segment here.
Those who think, I don't know, therefore God, would do themselves a service by stopping after I don't know and learning how to cope with uncertainty.
Okay, thank you. So here you have Dave basically counter-arguing against what's called the God of the Gaps argument. God of the Gaps is basically saying, if there's something that we don't understand, we don't know how this is working, therefore God did it. And Dave saying that's not a good argument. And I totally agree with him on that. I don't think that's an argument that makes sense. And Jim Torr doesn't use that argument. And I try not to also, of course. Again, science should be open to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And so you should stack up the evidence against the hypotheses and see which is best supported. So following the way that Dave calls out the bias of Jim Torr, he says Jim Torr is clouded and he can't be trusted to interpret origin of life data, and how he rejects the God of the Gaps argument on the slide you see before you here. It then comes as quite a surprise that in the same video, Dave makes the following statement. If you can play it forward again. Okay, right here. So this slide, you can read the text on it. He says, about the origin of life, Dave says, we may not know precisely what happened. There is no doubt that it happened totally naturally. So this is, in place of the God of the Gaps argument, this is kind of the opposite. This is what I call materialism of the gaps, or naturalism of the gaps. He's basically saying on the slide, we don't know what happened, therefore naturalism did it, right? So it's hypocrisy against what he just said in his own video. And I'm afraid his 900,000 plus viewers are going to be misled by this statement at the bottom here into thinking that it's a solved case, that we have all the evidence to prove that it's natural. And that's completely not the case. This is sensationalism. This is a statement of ideology. It's a statement of faith. It isn't science at all. Dave here is kind of showing that he's not speaking about science, but more being an evangelist, I think, for atheism. And so you see the hypocrisy here and you see the bias, and that's kind of the main point I wanted to make.
Well, I mean, the only thing I would say is, and I've heard this, I've actually experienced this personally in a debate on this topic. Life exists, therefore the probability is 1. And I think that's a very succinct way of saying that, hey, we believe that because life exists, it happened totally naturally. And here's our evidence. And I think the point you were making a minute ago of the circular evidence and circular reasoning, chicken and egg problem, I think that's embodied in that statement. Like, okay, so your answer is the only one?
Well, that again comes from taking those 2 hypotheses and blocking one out up front. And so all that's left is natural, and therefore it's true. That's a kind of a circular argument, right?